The silence inside Margaret Ellis's home had become almost unbearable. Since losing her husband, Harold, 18 months earlier, every room seemed frozen in time. His reading glasses still rested beside his favorite armchair. His gardening boots remained neatly arranged by the back door, untouched since the morning he was admitted to the hospital. At 58, Margaret had retired after 33 years as a respected school principal, believing retirement would be filled with travel, grandchildren, and quiet evenings with the man she loved. Instead, she found herself living alone with memories that refused to fade. Friends tried everything to lift her spirits. They invited her to church lunches, book clubs, neighborhood dinners, and weekend outings. Margaret appreciated every invitation but usually declined with a polite excuse. Grief had made the outside world feel strangely unfamiliar. She no longer recognized the cheerful woman she had once been. Everything changed after her closest friend, Denise, convinced her to volunteer at the town's annual charity fundraiser supporting families struggling with food insecurity. "You've spent your whole life helping people," Denise reminded her. "Maybe helping again is exactly what you need." Margaret reluctantly agreed. The community hall buzzed with laughter, live music, and volunteers carrying donated supplies between crowded tables. Margaret spent the afternoon organizing books for a fundraising sale, greeting visitors with the same calm kindness that had once comforted nervous students before important exams. Near closing time, a pleasant voice interrupted her concentration. "Those history books deserve someone who appreciates them." She looked up. A tall man with neatly combed gray hair stood beside the table, holding a box of donated novels. He appeared to be in his early 60s and wore a simple navy jacket over a light blue shirt. His warm smile reached his eyes, giving him an air of effortless sincerity. "I'm Daniel," he said, extending his hand. "Margaret." Their conversation began with books but soon wandered into travel, education, and community service. Daniel listened carefully whenever Margaret spoke, asking thoughtful questions instead of talking about himself. When she briefly mentioned losing her husband, he lowered his voice with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry," he said. "Some losses never really leave us." Margaret nodded quietly. "No," she replied. "They simply become part of who we are." Over the following weeks, Daniel called occasionally to ask how she was doing. They met for coffee after volunteer events and walked through the botanical gardens one quiet Saturday afternoon. He never rushed their friendship or pressured her into anything uncomfortable. His patience made Margaret feel safe. One evening, Daniel suggested a weekend getaway to a historic lakeside town known for its antique shops and scenic walking trails. "If you're not comfortable," he said gently, "we can forget I mentioned it." Margaret hesitated. For days she questioned herself. Was she betraying Harold's memory? Or was she finally allowing herself permission to live again? The answer came unexpectedly as she looked through an old photo album. Harold had always encouraged her to embrace life rather than fear it. Smiling through tears, she accepted Daniel's invitation. The weekend felt peaceful. They explored quiet streets lined with century-old buildings, shared long conversations beside the lake, and laughed over simple meals in family-owned restaurants. Daniel remained respectful throughout the trip, never giving Margaret a reason to question his intentions. When she returned home, she felt lighter than she had in years. Hope quietly replaced loneliness. Life resumed its normal rhythm. Daniel explained that work often required unexpected travel, so their conversations became less frequent. Margaret assumed busy schedules were simply part of adulthood and focused on gardening, volunteering, and reconnecting with friends. Nearly 2 months later, subtle changes began. She woke each morning exhausted despite sleeping through the night. Persistent fevers appeared without warning, followed by swollen glands and unexplained night sweats. Assuming she had caught a stubborn seasonal virus, Margaret scheduled an appointment with her longtime physician. After reviewing her symptoms and blood work, the doctor remained unusually thoughtful. "I'd like to run one additional test," he said carefully. Margaret frowned. "What kind of test?" The doctor folded his hands before answering. "I recommend we perform an HIV test." The words struck with such unexpected force that Margaret could only stare at him, completely unable to imagine how that single sentence was about to unravel everything she believed about the kind stranger named Daniel Cross. Margaret left the doctor's office feeling as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The recommendation for an HIV test echoed endlessly in her mind during the drive home. She replayed the conversation over and over, convincing herself there had been some misunderstanding. Surely the physician was simply being cautious. Surely the results would prove there was nothing to fear. For the next several days, she tried to continue her normal routine. She watered the flowers Harold had planted years before, attended Sunday church, and answered cheerful phone calls from friends while pretending everything was fine. Yet beneath every smile lay a growing anxiety she could no longer ignore. Every slight headache, every wave of exhaustion, every night sweat suddenly seemed frightening. The waiting became unbearable. For days later, the clinic called. The receptionist politely asked Margaret to return that afternoon because the doctor wished to discuss her results in person. Her heart sank. Doctors rarely insisted on face-to-face meetings for good news. She arrived early, sitting silently in the waiting room while patients chatted around her. A young couple laughed softly as they filled out paperwork. An elderly man flipped through a magazine. Ordinary life continued all around her while her own world seemed suspended in terrifying uncertainty. The doctor entered the consultation room carrying a thin folder. His expression told her everything before he spoke. "I'm very sorry, Margaret." The room suddenly felt too small. The test came back positive. She stared at him without blinking. "No." He gently placed the laboratory report on the desk. "We repeated the test to eliminate the possibility of an error. There has to be one. I'm afraid both results were positive." Margaret slowly shook her head. "That's impossible." Her voice cracked. "I've only ever been with my husband." The doctor nodded sympathetically. "I understand how difficult this is." "No, you don't." The words escaped before she realized she had spoken them aloud. "This doesn't happen to people like me." He patiently explained that HIV could often remain undetected for years and that modern treatment allowed many people to live long, healthy lives. He discussed specialists, medications, support services, and regular monitoring. Margaret heard almost nothing. She left carrying informational brochures she never intended to read. Once home, she locked the front door and collapsed into Harold's old armchair. The diagnosis felt unreal. She stared at the wedding photograph resting above the fireplace. 34 faithful years together. No affairs. No secrets. No reckless decisions. She whispered into the empty room. "How?" The question haunted every waking hour. Embarrassment quickly became fear. Fear became shame. Margaret stopped attending volunteer events and ignored invitations from friends. She convinced herself everyone would somehow discover the truth. Every glance from a neighbor felt suspicious. Every unanswered text message deepened her isolation. Sleep offered no relief. Night after night, she carefully retraced every significant moment since Harold's death. Doctor appointments, dental visits, hospital procedures, blood donations. Nothing explained the diagnosis. Then her thoughts returned to one person, Daniel Cross. She resisted the possibility immediately. Daniel had been thoughtful, patient, respectful. He had never behaved like someone capable of causing harm. Yet the more she searched her memory, the fewer alternatives remained. The following morning, she called his number. A recorded voice answered. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." Margaret frowned and tried again. The same message played. She opened their text conversation. Every message had vanished. Only her own replies remained, disconnected from any sender. Confused, she searched her email inbox. Nothing. It was as though every trace of Daniel had been erased overnight. Desperate, she drove to the small cafe where they had shared coffee nearly every Thursday. The young waitress smiled politely. "Can I help you?" Margaret showed her an old photograph stored on her phone. "Have you seen this man?" The waitress studied the image before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, I don't recognize him, but we came here together several times. I've worked here almost 2 years. She looked again. "I really don't remember him." Margaret left more confused than before. Her next stop was the community charity office where they had first met. The volunteer coordinator searched attendance records stretching back months. "We don't have anyone named Daniel Cross registered," she said apologetically. "He volunteered here. I'm afraid there's no record of that." Margaret felt her breathing quicken. She wasn't losing her memory. Someone had deliberately disappeared. That evening she spread photographs, handwritten notes, and receipts across her dining room table. The pieces no longer formed the story of an ordinary relationship. They looked like fragments of a carefully constructed illusion. As midnight approached, Margaret opened her laptop and typed a single search into the browser. Woman over 50 disappeared after dating man HIV diagnosis. She had no idea that somewhere among thousands of forgotten posts, another woman had been searching for exactly the same answers. Margaret barely noticed the sunrise. She had spent the entire night scrolling through online support forums, medical discussion boards, and forgotten community websites, searching for even the smallest clue that someone else had experienced what she was living through. Most posts focused on treatment, relationships, or overcoming stigma. None explained how a man could appear, gain complete trust, and vanish without leaving a trace. Then one discussion caught her attention. It was buried deep inside an old support forum with only a handful of replies. The title read, "Has anyone met a volunteer named Daniel who disappeared?" Margaret's pulse quickened. The anonymous writer described meeting a kind widower at a museum fundraiser. He loved history, enjoyed quiet walks, preferred small cafes over expensive restaurants, and always listened more than he spoke. After a brief relationship, he disappeared completely. Exactly 2 months later, she tested positive for HIV. Margaret reread the post 3 times. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Hands trembling, she created an account and sent a private message. "My name is Margaret. I believe we met the same man. If you're willing, please contact me. I think we're connected in ways neither of us understands." She checked the website repeatedly throughout the day. Nothing. Another day passed. Still no response. Margaret began convincing herself the account had been abandoned years earlier. Then, late the following evening, a notification appeared. "I don't know who you are, but if you're telling the truth, meet me Saturday at 11. Oakridge Botanical Gardens. Come alone." Saturday arrived beneath gray skies. Margaret reached the gardens 15 minutes early. She spotted the woman sitting quietly beside a small pond, holding a paper coffee cup with both hands. Her silver blonde hair framed a face marked by exhaustion rather than age. She appeared to be around 60, dressed simply in a beige coat despite the cool weather. "You must be Linda," Margaret said softly. The woman looked up cautiously. "And you're Margaret." Neither offered a handshake. Neither smiled. Trust had become far too expensive. After several silent moments, Linda motioned toward the empty bench beside her. "I almost canceled. I almost didn't come either." Margaret slowly described everything. Meeting Daniel at the charity fundraiser. Their growing friendship. The peaceful weekend away. The shocking diagnosis. His sudden disappearance. Linda listened without interruption. When Margaret finished speaking, Linda reached inside her handbag and removed an old photograph. Daniel smiled back from the faded print. His hair was slightly shorter, but his face was unmistakable. Margaret felt the color drain from her own. "That's him." Linda nodded slowly. He introduced himself as Daniel Cross. Margaret stared at her. He used the same name, the same stories, the same favorite books, the same joke about old bookstores smelling better than perfume. Margaret closed her eyes. "He said that to me." Silence settled between them. Finally, Linda spoke again. "My husband died 4 years ago." She explained that loneliness had eventually convinced her to volunteer at historical society events, where Daniel appeared unexpectedly. Their relationship followed almost the same timeline as Margaret's. He never rushed intimacy. He never argued. He remembered birthdays, favorite authors, and childhood memories. Then he vanished. 8 weeks later, Linda became ill. The diagnosis destroyed her confidence. "I blamed myself," she admitted quietly. "I thought everyone would believe I had been reckless. Margaret nodded through tears. I thought exactly the same thing. For the first time since leaving the doctor's office, she no longer felt completely alone. The women spent hours comparing every memory they could remember. Daniel preferred cash payments. He avoided taking photographs whenever possible. He claimed frequent business travel. He volunteered only briefly before disappearing. Every detail matched. Nothing appeared accidental. This can't be coincidence, Margaret whispered. Linda slowly removed a folded sheet of paper from her purse. I've been searching longer than you. Inside were 4 first names and 2 cities. Who are they? Margaret asked. Women I found mentioned in other support groups. You spoke to them? Linda shook her head. One refused. Another never answered. The others disappeared from the forums. Margaret stared at the names. If even one belonged to another victim, then Daniel had repeated the same deception again and again. A frightening realization settled over both women. They were not survivors of a single betrayal. They were part of something far larger. Somewhere, a man hiding behind borrowed names was moving quietly from town to town, carefully choosing lonely women over 50 before disappearing forever. Margaret folded the list carefully and slipped it into her handbag. We stopped looking for Daniel, she said. Linda frowned. What do you mean? Margaret's expression hardened for the first time since her diagnosis. We start proving he exists. Neither woman realized that hundreds of miles away, scattered police reports were already waiting for someone to connect the same horrifying pattern. Margaret's final words lingered in Linda Morrison's mind long after they left the botanical gardens. We start proving he exists. For weeks, both women had lived beneath the crushing weight of shame, believing they were isolated victims of an impossible betrayal. Now that illusion had disappeared. If Daniel had deceived both of them using the same carefully rehearsed story, then somewhere there had to be evidence he had done it before. They agreed to work quietly. Neither trusted the internet enough to discuss details publicly, and neither wanted their identities exposed before they understood the truth. Every evening they spoke by phone, comparing discoveries while keeping careful notes inside matching binders. Margaret searched charity organizations, volunteer rosters, and archived event photographs. Linda focused on genealogy records, historical societies, and forgotten online discussion forums where lonely people often shared dating experiences. The first breakthrough came almost by accident. Margaret found an old volunteer newsletter from a neighboring county featuring a smiling man identified as David Carter. The photograph was small and grainy, but the eyes were unmistakable. It has to be him, she whispered. She immediately sent the image to Linda. Linda replied only seconds later. It's Daniel. The newsletter listed David Carter as a guest volunteer who helped organize a literacy fundraiser before relocating several weeks later. Another name, another disappearance. The discoveries accelerated. A museum archive mentioned Michael Turner, praised for donating rare history books before suddenly ending his membership. An animal rescue organization thanked Stephen Blake for several generous cash donations. A community theater recognized Robert Hayes for sponsoring renovations before he quietly vanished. Different names, different towns, the same face. Each identity lasted only long enough to gain trust before disappearing forever. Even more disturbing, Margaret began noticing a pattern among the women who appeared beside those names in archived photographs. Most looked to be over 50. Several later disappeared from volunteer activities altogether. Linda managed to contact one woman through an old community newsletter. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. I'm sorry, the woman whispered. I don't talk about him anymore. The call ended abruptly. Another woman answered an email but refused to discuss details. I've spent years trying to forget. Her reply contained no further explanation. Margaret slowly began understanding something horrifying. Daniel didn't rely on threats. He relied on silence. Across the state, Detective Olivia Grant reviewed a stack of neglected reports forwarded from neighboring jurisdictions. At 39, Olivia had earned a reputation for spotting patterns hidden inside ordinary paperwork. Most detectives preferred solving straightforward cases with clear suspects and obvious evidence. Olivia preferred questions. One report described a forged driver's license used to rent a motel room. Another involved an elderly volunteer claiming she had been deceived by a man who disappeared without explanation. A third mentioned fraudulent identification documents recovered after a storage unit eviction. Individually, the complaints seemed unrelated. Together, they felt strangely connected. She spread every file across her office floor. Different cities, different dates, different names. Yet witnesses repeatedly described the same type of man. Polite, educated, soft-spoken, approximately 60 years old. Frequently involved with charity events or volunteer organizations. Always gone before anyone thought to question him. Olivia circled each matching detail with a red marker. By evening, the separate reports resembled pieces of a puzzle rather than isolated investigations. "There you are," she murmured. The following morning she requested assistance from several state agencies, asking investigators to search for similar complaints involving false identities connected to community organizations. Responses began arriving almost immediately. More aliases surfaced. More abandoned phone numbers. More forged identification documents. One detective attached a short note. "We've never been able to identify this man." Meanwhile, Margaret and Linda uncovered another important clue. An old historical society membership application listed Daniel's emergency contact address. Excited, they drove there together. The building had been demolished nearly 7 years earlier. Only an empty parking lot remained. Another identity. Another lie. Linda sighed heavily. "It feels impossible." Margaret looked down at the growing binder resting on her lap. No. She carefully tapped the pages filled with names, photographs, and dates. People disappear. She paused. Patterns don't. At that exact moment, Detective Olivia Grant opened a newly received witness statement submitted only days earlier. The signature at the bottom caught her attention. Margaret Ellis. Olivia immediately reached for the telephone. For the first time, the invisible man with countless names had left behind something stronger than another false identity. He had left survivors who refused to remain silent. Detective Olivia Grant wasted no time after reading Margaret Ellis's statement. Within hours, she arranged a private meeting with both Margaret and Linda Morrison at the Regional Investigative Office. Neither woman had ever spoken with a detective about Daniel before, but they immediately recognized that Olivia was different. She listened carefully, interrupted only to clarify details, and wrote down even the smallest observations. By the end of the interview, one fact became impossible to ignore. Daniel had never repeated an identity. Every alias disappeared forever after serving its purpose. That level of preparation suggested years of planning rather than random deception. Olivia submitted every known fingerprint, photograph, and forged document to state and federal databases. Most searches produced nothing useful. The identities were fabricated, and the fingerprints had never matched anyone with a criminal conviction. Then an overlooked report from nearly 20 years earlier surfaced. A motel manager had reported a teenage drifter suspected of using false identification. The case had been dismissed because no serious crime occurred, but investigators had collected one fingerprint before releasing the young man. This time, technology found something previously missed. The print belonged to Daniel Mercer. For the first time, the invisible man had a real name. Olivia immediately began searching historical court archives connected to Daniel Mercer. Most records had been sealed because they involved a juvenile, but several files became available after legal review due to the deaths of everyone directly connected to the original custody proceedings. Boxes of aging documents arrived from county storage. Yellowed newspaper clippings, social worker reports, school attendance records, psychological evaluations. Together they reconstructed a childhood shaped by chaos. Daniel's father died in an industrial accident when Daniel was only 8 years old. His mother, Rebecca Mercer, struggled to cope with overwhelming grief. Alcohol slowly replaced stability, and the once loving household collapsed beneath addiction. Teachers documented neglected homework, unexplained bruises from accidents inside the home, and frequent absences from school. Neighbors repeatedly contacted Child Protective Services. Eventually, the county petitioned for emergency custody. The hearings lasted several months and attracted unusual public attention because respected members of the community volunteered to testify. A retired principal, a church outreach director, a children's librarian, a school counselor, a volunteer nurse. Every woman who appeared before the judge was between 50 and 60 years old. Each described witnessing Daniel's worsening living conditions. Together, their testimony persuaded the court that Rebecca Mercer could no longer safely care for her son. Daniel entered foster care. Rebecca disappeared less than a year later. Her body was never found. Olivia carefully examined the psychological evaluations completed during Daniel's placement. One sentence immediately stood out. The child refuses to blame his mother's addiction for the separation. Instead, he repeatedly states that older women convinced the court to steal his family. Another report documented Daniel's behavior during therapy. Whenever counselors mentioned the custody hearing, he became withdrawn before suddenly erupting in anger. "They ruined everything," he reportedly shouted. "They took her away." The psychiatrist recommended years of intensive counseling to address unresolved trauma, abandonment, and growing resentment toward female authority figures. Funding ended after only 6 months. Daniel disappeared from the system shortly afterward. Olivia leaned back in her chair. Years of untreated grief had quietly transformed into obsession. He had spent decades searching for women who resembled those standing outside the courthouse on the day his childhood ended. Not because they personally harmed him, because they symbolized everything he refused to forgive. Margaret and Linda listened in stunned silence as Olivia explained her findings. "So we reminded him of those women?" Margaret asked quietly. Olivia nodded. "You were never chosen because of who you were. You were chosen because of what he believed you represented." Linda lowered her eyes. "He punished strangers for something that happened 40 years ago." "Yes." Margaret stared at the faded courtroom photograph Olivia placed on the table. 5 respectable women smiled gently after believing they had protected a vulnerable child. None could have imagined that decades later, a broken boy would spend his adult life hunting women who looked just like them. The discovery answered countless questions. It explained the age of the victims, the community events, the patience, the emotional manipulation. Yet one frightening mystery remained. If Daniel viewed every victim as another chapter in his childhood revenge, then he would never stop voluntarily. Olivia closed the final file. "We're no longer investigating fraud." She looked directly at Margaret and Linda. "We're hunting someone who believes he's delivering justice." Before anyone could respond, another detective hurried into the office carrying confidential reports from neighboring states. The number of possible victims had doubled overnight. And for the first time, investigators feared they had uncovered only a fraction of Daniel Mercer's carefully hidden crimes. The stack of confidential reports placed before Detective Olivia Grant confirmed what she had already feared. Daniel Mercer had not destroyed a handful of lives. He had spent years moving quietly from one community to another, leaving behind victims who rarely knew they shared the same nightmare. Every new document widened the investigation, transforming a single criminal case into a network of tragedies stretching across multiple states. Within days, a multi-agency task force was assembled. Because many of the reports involved protected medical information, investigators worked alongside public health officials under strict confidentiality agreements. Names remained sealed whenever possible, but anonymous case details allowed specialists to compare timelines, locations, and patterns without violating privacy laws. The similarities were chilling. Women between 50 and 65, recently widowed, divorced, or living alone, introduced to a polite, educated man through volunteer work, museums, churches, or charity organizations. A brief relationship, then silence. Weeks later came unexplained illness and an HIV diagnosis. One investigator pinned a map to the conference room wall. Red markers multiplied rapidly. One city became 3. 3 became 8. By the end of the week, nearly 24 locations had been identified as possible stops along Daniel's carefully planned route. "He isn't wandering," Olivia observed. "He's following a circuit." Behavioral analysts agreed. Daniel returned to similar regions every few years, changing his appearance just enough to avoid recognition while adopting another carefully crafted identity. Every alias had a believable background, temporary employment, and convincing personal history. He studies communities before entering them, one analyst explained. He knows exactly where emotionally vulnerable people gather. Unlike many violent offenders, Daniel rarely attracted immediate suspicion. He never robbed his victims. He never demanded money. He never forced entry into homes or left obvious crime scenes behind. Instead, he invested something far more dangerous: time. He patiently built emotional trust. He remembered birthdays, favorite books, family stories, and personal dreams. He offered companionship to women rebuilding their lives after devastating loss. By the time he disappeared, his victims believed they had simply experienced another heartbreaking relationship. Only later did they discover something far worse. Margaret listened quietly during one investigative briefing before asking a question that had troubled her for weeks. How many women never reported him? The room fell silent. No one knew. Public health representatives estimated the true number could be significantly higher because many individuals diagnosed with HIV chose complete privacy. Others never connected their illness to Daniel's deception. Some may have believed the diagnosis resulted from circumstances they no longer remembered or understood. Shame had become Daniel's greatest protection. Margaret began reading anonymous victim statements collected by investigators. Each account carried familiar emotions: confusion, embarrassment, self-blame. One woman admitted she told her family she had developed an autoimmune disease because revealing the truth felt impossible. Another ended a lifelong friendship after overhearing cruel gossip about people living with HIV. A retired nurse confessed she burned every photograph of Daniel before convincing herself the relationship had never happened. "I was more afraid of people judging me," one statement read, "than I was of the man who disappeared." Margaret slowly lowered the page. Tears filled her eyes. "That's exactly how he survived." Linda nodded sadly. "He counted on us staying silent." Neither woman blamed the victims. They understood every painful decision. Society often questions survivors before questioning those who harmed them. Daniel recognized that fear and quietly transformed it into another weapon. Not violence, not threats, humiliation. That evening, Margaret attended her first confidential support meeting organized through the public health department. No cameras, no reporters, only women quietly introducing themselves by first names alone. Listening to their stories changed something inside her. She no longer saw isolated victims. She saw ordinary people who had been manipulated by someone who understood loneliness better than compassion. When the meeting ended, Margaret remained behind to help stack chairs. A woman she had never met gently touched her arm. "Thank you for speaking today." Margaret smiled faintly. "I almost didn't. I'm glad you did." Driving home, Margaret realized silence had protected Daniel far longer than any false identity ever could. Across town, Detective Grant received an urgent message from another jurisdiction. Surveillance officers believed they had identified a man matching Daniel Mercer's description volunteering at a community fundraiser under yet another name. The woman frequently seen speaking with him was 54 years old, recently divorced, and worked as a registered nurse. Olivia immediately stood up. For the first time in years, investigators believed they might reach his next target before Daniel disappeared again. The surveillance photographs arrived at Detective Olivia Grant's office just before sunrise. The man standing beside a donation table introduced himself as Andrew Collins, a retired financial consultant who claimed he had recently relocated to Fairbrook after years of traveling for work. His neatly trimmed beard and slightly longer gray hair disguised him well, but Olivia recognized the familiar eyes immediately. Daniel Mercer had chosen another identity. This time, investigators were already watching. Fairbrook's annual health awareness fundraiser attracted dozens of volunteers every weekend, making it the perfect place for someone seeking lonely people eager to reconnect with their community. Officers in plain clothes quietly blended into the crowd, careful not to alert Daniel before they understood his next move. Within hours, they identified the woman receiving most of his attention. Susan Harper, 54 years old, a registered nurse who had finalized a painful divorce less than a year earlier after discovering her husband's long-term affair. Friends described Susan as compassionate but emotionally exhausted. Volunteering had become her way of rebuilding confidence after months of isolation. Olivia studied the surveillance images with growing concern. It matches every previous pattern. Daniel helped Susan carry donation boxes, shared coffee during breaks, and listened patiently whenever she spoke. He never appeared overly charming or aggressive. Instead, he projected quiet dependability, the same carefully practiced kindness every known victim had described. Margaret recognized the expression on Susan's face. Hope. She had worn that same expression once. Olivia instructed her team to continue monitoring Daniel while preparing enough evidence to justify intervention. Moving too early risked losing him again. Waiting too long could place another woman in danger. Margaret struggled with the decision. Every instinct told her Susan deserved immediate warning. Detective Grant disagreed. If he realizes we're watching, Olivia explained, he'll disappear before we can identify his next identity. Margaret understood the strategy. She simply couldn't accept the risk. That evening, she found Susan's phone number through the fundraiser's public volunteer directory. Her hands trembled before dialing. The call connected after 3 rings. Hello? My name is Margaret Ellis, she said quietly. Please don't hang up. I need to tell you something important about the man you've been spending time with. A brief silence followed. Andrew? His real name isn't Andrew. Susan laughed nervously. I think you've made a mistake. I wish I had. Margaret carefully described her own experience without revealing confidential details of the investigation. She explained Daniel's disappearing identities, the sudden end of their relationship, and the devastating consequences that followed. Susan listened politely. When Margaret finished, another long silence filled the line. He seems like such a gentle man. So did the man I trusted. Susan sighed. I appreciate your concern. Please. Margaret's voice nearly broke. Don't meet him alone. I'll think about what you've said. The conversation ended. Margaret immediately regretted disobeying Detective Grant. Meanwhile, Daniel noticed subtle changes almost immediately. Susan canceled dinner plans. She asked unexpected questions about his family. She casually requested identification after mentioning a volunteer registration update. None of those questions matched the routine he had perfected over many years. Something had changed. That night, Daniel parked across the street from the community center and quietly observed volunteers leaving the building. 2 unfamiliar vehicles remained nearby long after everyone else had departed. Inside one sat plainclothes officers. Daniel drove away without attracting attention. His pulse remained calm, but his thoughts accelerated. Someone was watching him. Back inside his motel room, he carefully dismantled the Andrew Collins identity. Forged documents disappeared into a portable shredder. The prepaid cell phone snapped cleanly in half. Clothing purchased specifically for the persona was packed into garbage bags. Every movement remained controlled. Every decision deliberate. Yet beneath the discipline, something unfamiliar emerged. Uncertainty. For the first time in years, Daniel abandoned an identity before completing his carefully rehearsed routine. The following morning, Susan arrived at the fundraiser expecting to see Andrew. Another volunteer greeted her instead. He called early. What happened? He said a family emergency forced him out of town. Susan looked toward the empty parking lot. Somehow, the explanation felt rehearsed. Across the state, Detective Grant received confirmation that Daniel Mercer had vanished once again. She expected frustration. Instead, she noticed something encouraging. He broke his own pattern, Olivia said quietly. Margaret frowned. What does that mean? It means someone finally forced him to improvise. Neither woman realized Daniel had not disappeared to escape. He had vanished to discover exactly who had interfered with his revenge. And this time, he intended to strike back before anyone could stop him. Daniel Mercer's sudden disappearance confirmed what Detective Olivia Grant already suspected. He knew someone had disrupted his routine, and once Daniel sensed danger, he never returned to the same identity. Every previous investigation had ended at that point. Another name would appear months later in another city, and the cycle would begin again. This time, however, luck intervened. 3 days after Daniel abandoned the Andrew Collins identity, police received a phone call from the manager of a self-storage facility outside Fairbrook. One rental unit had fallen behind on payments, and the paperwork contained irregular identification documents. The name on the contract, Michael Turner, matched one of Daniel's previously discovered aliases. Olivia immediately secured a search warrant. The storage locker looked ordinary from the outside. Inside, it felt like stepping into someone else's carefully preserved life. Plastic storage bins lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Each container carried neatly handwritten labels rather than random numbers. Shelves held different styles of clothing, reading glasses, hats, jackets, shoes, and grooming supplies. Several wallets contained forged driver's licenses issued under various names investigators had already uncovered. It was an organized collection of stolen identities. One corner contained travel maps marked with colored circles around libraries, churches, museums, historical societies, and community centers. Every location matched places where Daniel had previously met victims. He planned everything, one detective whispered. Olivia slowly continued searching. Beneath a folding table rested a locked metal case. Forensic technicians opened it carefully. Inside lay 34 flash drives arranged in chronological order. Each carried nothing except a handwritten date. The investigation team transferred every recording onto secure computers before reviewing the contents. The first video began without introduction. Daniel sat alone inside what appeared to be an inexpensive motel room. A small lamp illuminated only half his face. His expression remained calm, almost peaceful. "My name doesn't matter," he began. "It changes whenever it has to." He looked directly into the camera. "Purpose never changes." Olivia remained silent as the recording continued. Daniel described his childhood with remarkable clarity. He never mentioned his crimes. Instead, he spoke about betrayal, about loneliness, about the day strangers decided his family deserved to end. They called themselves protectors. They smiled while they destroyed everything. Each new recording revealed another piece of his distorted thinking. Daniel rarely referred to women by their names. Instead, he described them as reflections. They all become the same eventually. The voice, the advice, the certainty. They always believe they're saving someone. Behavioral analysts exchanged uneasy glances. He no longer distinguished between his victims and the women who testified during his childhood custody hearing. Decades had erased individual identities. Only symbols remained. Another recording proved even more disturbing. Daniel calmly explained why he avoided robbery or physical violence. Money disappears. Bruises heal. He paused thoughtfully. Memory survives. According to his twisted reasoning, emotional devastation lasted longer than any physical injury. He believed every woman who suffered afterward carried a fraction of the abandonment he experienced as a child. "I don't create pain. I return it." There was no anger in his voice, no shouting, no excitement, only absolute certainty. Margaret and Linda later viewed selected recordings approved by prosecutors. Neither woman recognized the gentle companion they had once trusted. Linda quietly wiped away tears. "He never saw us." Margaret nodded. "We were never people. We were punishments." Olivia paused the video. He convinced himself long ago that every victim deserved what happened before he ever met her. Psychological experts reviewing the recordings reached the same conclusion. Daniel displayed no genuine remorse. He believed history would eventually judge him differently than the courts. One forensic psychiatrist summarized his mindset in a single sentence. He doesn't think he's documenting crimes. He thinks he's recording evidence for his own defense. The final flash drive contained the shortest message. Daniel stared silently into the camera for nearly half a minute before speaking. "If you're watching this." He smiled faintly. Someone finally refused to stay afraid. The recording ended immediately. No explanation followed. The room remained completely silent. Margaret looked toward Olivia. He expected survivors to fight back. Olivia replayed the final sentence twice. Daniel had anticipated resistance. That meant he probably anticipated investigators eventually discovering the storage locker as well. The recordings were not hidden out of fear. They had been preserved intentionally, almost like a message waiting for an audience. Before anyone could discuss the discovery further, another detective entered carrying freshly processed highway surveillance photographs. One image showed Daniel driving north less than 12 hours earlier beneath yet another borrowed identity. Beside him sat an unfamiliar woman investigators had never seen before. Olivia immediately stood. Find her. Because after hearing Daniel explain his twisted philosophy, everyone understood one terrifying truth. He wasn't running from the investigation. He was racing toward his final act of revenge. The highway surveillance photographs transformed weeks of uncertainty into a race against time. After reviewing the footage frame by frame, investigators identified the rental vehicle Daniel Mercer had been driving under yet another false identity. The paperwork listed the name Robert Hayes, but Detective Olivia Grant no longer cared what Daniel called himself. Every alias pointed to the same destination. Traffic cameras followed the vehicle north toward the isolated Lake Briar region. Dense pine forests surrounded the lake, where scattered vacation cabins remained mostly empty outside the tourist season. The remoteness made the area ideal for someone who wanted privacy, and Olivia immediately feared Daniel had chosen it for exactly that reason. Investigators quickly identified the woman sitting beside him in the surveillance image. Her name was Eleanor Pierce, 56 years old, widowed 3 years earlier. A retired accountant who had recently begun volunteering at a literacy program after months of grieving alone. The familiar pattern left little room for doubt. Daniel had found another target. Police quietly established surveillance around the lake while tracing the rental records to a secluded cabin reserved under the Robert Hayes identity. Olivia resisted ordering an immediate raid. She feared Daniel would flee at the first sign of police activity, disappearing once again beneath another carefully constructed name. Margaret refused to remain behind. "I'm coming," she said firmly. Olivia shook her head. "This could become dangerous. So was the day I met him. You don't owe anyone this risk." Margaret's expression hardened. "I owe Eleanor the warning nobody gave me." Olivia studied her for several long seconds before reluctantly agreeing. As dusk settled over Lake Briar, unmarked police vehicles silently surrounded the narrow gravel road leading to the cabin. Rain drifted through the towering pines, muffling footsteps as officers quietly took their positions. Warm light glowed through the cabin windows. Someone was inside. Olivia signaled her team to wait. Margaret slowly approached the front porch accompanied by one detective. She knocked gently. After several tense seconds, the door opened. A pleasant-looking woman smiled politely. "Can I help you?" Margaret recognized Eleanor immediately from the surveillance photographs. "My name is Margaret Ellis." Confusion crossed Eleanor's face. "I think you've been spending time with a man who isn't who he claims to be." Before Eleanor could answer, a familiar voice echoed from deeper inside the cabin. "I wondered when you'd find me." Daniel stepped calmly into view. His expression showed neither panic nor surprise, only quiet acceptance. His eyes settled on Margaret. "You warned the nurse." Margaret remained silent. Daniel nodded slowly. "I should have realized." Olivia entered the cabin with 2 officers. "Daniel Mercer." Her voice remained steady. "Step away from the doorway and place your hands where I can see them." He smiled faintly. "That name belongs to a boy who stopped existing years ago. It belongs to the man under arrest." For several moments, nobody moved. Rain tapped softly against the cabin windows. Daniel looked toward Margaret once more. "You still believe this was about cruelty?" She finally spoke. "What else could it possibly have been?" His answer came without hesitation. "Punishment." He said the word as calmly as someone discussing tomorrow's weather. "I never hated you. I hated what you represented." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. "You don't even know me." Daniel slowly shook his head. "I know enough. You remind me of them." Olivia stepped forward. "The women who testified against your mother were trying to protect you." No. For the first time, Genuine emotion flashed across Daniel's face. "They stole my family. They saved your life. They abandoned me." His voice echoed through the cabin before silence returned. Without warning, Daniel grabbed a heavy wooden chair and hurled it toward the nearest officer. The chair crashed loudly across the room, creating just enough confusion for him to sprint toward the rear hallway. "Stop!" Olivia shouted. Daniel burst through the back door into the pouring rain. Officers raced after him. The steep hillside leading toward the lake had become dangerously slippery beneath the storm. Daniel stumbled repeatedly across wet rocks while flashlights cut through the darkness behind him. "Police! Don't move!" He ignored every command. Determined to escape one final time, he pushed deeper into the forest before losing his footing near the shoreline. He crashed down the muddy embankment, striking the ground hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. Before he could recover, officers surrounded him from every direction. Daniel looked around silently. For the first time in years, every path had disappeared. He slowly raised his hands. As handcuffs closed around his wrists, Margaret watched from the edge of the clearing without saying a word. The man who had spent decades hiding behind borrowed names had finally run out of places to disappear. Yet even as emergency lights reflected across the rain-soaked lake, Margaret understood the capture marked only the end of the chase. The hardest part would begin inside a courtroom, where every survivor would finally have to confront the man who believed revenge had made him righteous. Daniel Mercer survived the injuries sustained during his failed escape at Lake Briar and remained under constant guard while recovering in the hospital. Even restrained to his bed, he displayed the same unsettling composure that had defined every recorded diary investigators recovered from the storage locker. He answered routine questions with short replies, requested an attorney, and otherwise spent his days in complete silence. The confidence that once fueled his carefully planned identities had disappeared, replaced by the certainty that there would be no more escapes. For months later, the trial began. The courthouse quickly filled with reporters, legal observers, and survivors who had traveled from several states to witness the proceedings. Prosecutors described Daniel's crimes as a calculated campaign of emotional manipulation carried out over many years. Rather than relying on violence or theft, he deliberately earned trust before disappearing, leaving victims to face devastating medical diagnoses and unbearable shame alone. The evidence was overwhelming. Jurors watched carefully selected portions of Daniel's video diaries recovered from the storage locker. They listened as he calmly described older women as symbols rather than individuals, insisting he was correcting a historical injustice instead of committing crimes. His steady voice never wavered. Not once did he express remorse. Margaret Ellis became the first survivor called to testify. She walked slowly to the witness stand, determined not to let fear control her again. Looking directly at the jury, she described the loneliness that followed her husband's death, the hope Daniel briefly restored, and the unimaginable shock of learning she was HIV positive only weeks after trusting him. "He didn't just steal my health," Margaret said quietly. "He stole my ability to believe kindness was safe." The courtroom remained silent. Linda Morrison testified next. She admitted she had nearly destroyed every reminder of Daniel because she blamed herself more than the man who deceived her. She described months of hiding from family members, terrified they would judge her without knowing the truth. "I thought silence would protect me," Linda whispered. "Protected him instead." One after another, survivors stepped forward. A retired librarian, a former nurse, a church volunteer, a museum docent. Each woman told a different story that ended with the same heartbreaking pattern of trust, disappearance, diagnosis, and isolation. Their words painted a devastating picture far more powerful than any physical evidence. Detective Olivia Grant explained how scattered complaints from different jurisdictions gradually formed a single investigation. She described Daniel's carefully constructed aliases, his deliberate selection of emotionally vulnerable women, and the years spent connecting crimes hidden behind shame and silence. Defense attorneys attempted to portray Daniel as a psychologically damaged man whose traumatic childhood shaped his actions. The prosecution did not dispute his past. They argued that suffering never justified deliberately inflicting suffering upon innocent strangers. After several hours of deliberation, the jury returned unanimous guilty verdicts on every applicable charge. The judge imposed multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, describing Daniel's conduct as one of the most calculated betrayals of trust the court had ever encountered. No celebration followed the verdict. Only quiet relief. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked Margaret whether justice had finally brought closure. She paused before answering. "Justice matters," she said softly. "But no sentence can give anyone back the years they spent questioning themselves, fearing tomorrow, or wondering whether life would ever feel normal again." She embraced Linda before leaving the courthouse together with the other survivors. Daniel Mercer had finally lost his freedom. Yet Margaret understood that true healing would never be delivered by a judge. It would begin only when survivors chose to reclaim the hope he had tried so carefully to destroy, a journey that would quietly redefine the rest of her life. 6 months after Daniel Mercer's conviction, Margaret Ellis unlocked the doors of a small community wellness center before sunrise. The building was modest, with faded brick walls and simple meeting rooms. Yet it had become a place where fear slowly transformed into courage. Every Wednesday evening, older women gathered there to speak openly about HIV, emotional abuse, and the loneliness that often followed betrayal. No one judged another person's story. Everyone understood that survival looked different for each individual. Margaret no longer introduced herself as a victim. She preferred another word: survivor. The distinction mattered. For years Daniel had controlled the narrative of countless lives, convincing women through manipulation and shame that they would never be believed if they spoke. Margaret refused to let his voice become the final chapter of her own story. Linda Morrison stood beside her before each meeting, greeting newcomers with a warm smile that had once seemed impossible. Together they organized educational workshops with doctors, counselors, and social workers who specialized in trauma recovery. The gatherings were never about reliving pain. They focused on rebuilding confidence, restoring dignity, and reminding every woman that compassion still existed despite what had happened. One evening, Susan Harper quietly entered the room carrying homemade cookies. She laughed softly as Margaret hugged her. "I still think about that phone call," Susan admitted. "So do I," Margaret replied. "If you hadn't ignored the advice to stay away, I might never have questioned him." Margaret smiled gently. "Sometimes doing the right thing feels risky." Susan nodded. "And sometimes it saves a life." Across town, Detective Olivia Grant sat alone in her office surrounded by neatly stacked case files waiting for review. On the corner of her desk rested one thick folder labeled Daniel Mercer. It contained years of interviews, forensic reports, surveillance photographs, medical evidence, and courtroom transcripts documenting an investigation that had consumed countless hours. She opened the file one final time. Inside was a photograph taken outside the courthouse after sentencing. Margaret, Linda, Susan. Several other survivors stood together, smiling quietly beneath gray skies. Olivia studied the image before signing the final closure report. Many investigations ended with arrests. Some ended with convictions. This one ended because one woman had been saved before another tragedy could unfold. For Olivia, that would always remain the greatest success. She placed the folder inside the department archive and switched off the office lights. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the courthouse steps where months earlier survivors had confronted the man who believed revenge justified every decision he made. Daniel Mercer would spend the remainder of his life behind prison walls, but his crimes would never define those who refused to remain silent. Later that evening, Margaret locked the wellness center after another successful meeting. She watched several women leave together, laughing as they walked toward the parking lot. Not long ago, many of them had believed they would carry their shame alone forever. Now they carried one another instead. Margaret glanced toward the darkening sky and took a slow, peaceful breath. She had learned that monsters rarely looked frightening. Sometimes they arrived with patient smiles, thoughtful conversations, and gentle promises carefully designed to earn trust before revealing unimaginable cruelty. That truth deserved to be remembered, because predators often hide behind kindness. and silence will always remain the strongest weapon they hope their victims never choose to take away.